Well, hello everyone. So today we're talking about refutation, which I think is probably one of the most important things we can talk about when discussing debate. When you describe debate to people, particularly who don't understand what debating is, I think that if they didn't understand refutation, they wouldn't understand debate. Because debate is about critiquing the arguments from the other side. And it's not only possible, but there are many debates in which it occurs that proposition will make one set of arguments, and opposition makes another set of arguments, and they don't ever work to compare the arguments or to criticize the other side's arguments. And I think that in those circumstances, when you don't have that level of interaction between teams, when you don't have the teams talking about the other side's arguments, you're not really having a debate. You're having maybe two different sets of competing oratory, but it's not until those arguments are compared by the other side to the offering of the other side that you really end up having a debate. So I think this is perhaps one of the most important skills that you can learn when it comes to debating. And if you do it well, then I think you quickly become a much better debater. So I want to talk about a couple of things. I want to talk about, first of all, a reminder of what an argument is and how arguments work. And then we'll talk about a couple of different types of refutation. There are two primary types of refutation. And we'll talk just very briefly about how to do each of those types of refutation. So let's start with this. This is an argument. You recognize this as an argument. You already been making these sorts of arguments in your practice rounds. You watch debates in which people are making arguments like this. But it's worthwhile kind of refreshing our memory about how these arguments work. When we do, then we'll be better able to understand how to critique or take those arguments apart. So, if I make a claim like smoking should be banned, we know that that statement by itself is not an argument. Smoking should be banned might be my opinion, but simply saying that does not make an argument. It's not an argument until I start to give reasons why smoking should be banned, until I offer evidence that serves as a foundation for why that claim should be accepted as true. So I might say, for example, smoking should be banned because smoking poses a significant public health risk. Now I've started to make an argument, right? Now I start to give a reason why we should ban smoking. And insofar as I've given that reason, I put together a series of statements that can lead the audience from one belief to another belief. But we also know that sometimes the evidence that we offer might not be accepted by our audience. It's possible that I could say smoking should be banned because it poses a significant public health risk. And people might not believe that smoking poses a significant public health risk. There was a time in the US, and I'm certain in China as well, when we were largely ignorant of the risks of smoking. Matter of fact, one of the claims that advertisers for cigarettes used to use is that doctors endorsed a certain brand of cigarettes. Could you imagine encountering that now? Right? A doctor saying it's good to smoke Camel cigarettes, helps your health, improves your livelihood, and it'd be crazy. So it's entirely possible that even the evidence that we offer might need to be substantiated with more evidence. Simply saying that smoking poses a significant public health risk might not be enough to convince people that that is true. You might need to offer further evidence in the form of something like a factual report. The 2008 World Health Organization report on the worldwide death rates among smokers, for example, might be a piece of information that is more likely to be believed by your audience, which could serve as a foundation for the claim that smoking poses a significant public health risk, that in turn becomes the basis for accepting the claim that smoking should be banned. The important thing to remember here is that arguments are made up of linear thought, right? Linear ideas. We put ideas in a particular order because we want to move our audience through those ideas. Now, if we know that debate is about this contest of arguments, then simply making an argument is not enough. We have to criticize the arguments of the other side. We have to find the reasons why those arguments might not be good arguments. So there are a couple of different places that you can make criticisms of arguments, a couple of different ways that you can make criticisms of arguments. Either you can argue that there's something wrong in this ordering of information, that there's something wrong with how this argument is put together, or the order in which this argument is put together, and that's a reason why the audience should reject it. So if you can prove, for example, that smoking doesn't pose a significant public health risk, or that the evidence offered for the claim that smoking poses a significant public health risk is flawed, then you've got a basis on which to criticize this argument. Similarly, if you can argue that the reasoning process that connects these pieces of evidence is flawed, then you can also find a way to criticize that argument. That's what we call direct refutation. When you look at the evidence, or you look at the connections between the pieces of evidence offered, and you offer a critique of that evidence or those connections, you're engaged in direct refutation. But what if, or I should ask you this, can you imagine a circumstance in which you're in a debate and you decide to concede that smoking does pose a significant public health risk? Would it be possible to win a debate about banning smoking if you were on the opposition? Government side argued that smoking poses a significant public health risk, and you wanted to concede that argument. You wanted to say, you're right, it does pose a significant public health risk. Could you still win the debate?
Yeah.
Who said yeah? How could you do that? What might you argue? It doesn't have to be the perfect argument, but give me an example of what you might argue if you admit that it poses a significant public health risk.
I might do that on several layers. Firstly, we think that those smokers will understand that they are putting themselves in great dangers of health.
Okay.
And so they have already considered that, and they know the consequences of behavior, and we think they are rational. And secondly, as long as they are not harming others' health, the smoking in public places, we think smoking privately is completely okay, as long as they are fully aware of the consequences.
Okay. So generally it comes down to smokers have a right to smoke, right? And this is a terrific way to oppose to this argument. You might say, yes, smoking poses a significant public health risk, but it's not as bad as infringing upon the right of individuals to choose to smoke. We can tolerate some public health risk if it means that we get to have the right to smoke. We do that all the time. There's all sorts of risks we tolerate so that we can have the right to do certain things. When you decide to refute an argument not by attacking the internal structure of the argument, but by evaluating the ultimate goal of the argument, you're engaged in indirect refutation. So today we're going to talk about those two different styles of refutation. Direct refutation, taking apart the workings of the argument itself, or indirect refutation, arguing the merit of that argument relative to the larger motion that's being debated, and talk about how each of those work. So, what is deconstructive argumentation or refutation? It's the critique of opposing arguments. What I also like to refer to as pushing back against the opponent's arguments. There are a couple different kinds. There's pushing back within the issues. This is what you might refer to more specifically as direct refutation. And there's pushing back by comparing issues. What we talk about in terms of indirect refutation. To understand how this works, I want to spend some time talking about what issues are and how we can use issues today to organize your refutation. Once you understand that, you'll understand each style of refutation better, and then we talk best about how to do that style of refutation. So what are issues? Issues are the small points of clash that exist within the much larger debate. So imagine, for example, that the large blue background here is the entirety of the debate. If it's a debate about smoking, then within that border, within that space, are all of the arguments that you might exchange about whether or not we should ban smoking. But within that territory, within that space of all of those arguments, there are going to be smaller issues, smaller places of contest between the pro side and the con side, between the proposition and the opposition. We call these issues. Now generally you've probably seen these, particularly you see them in whip speeches when people talk about the points of clash that exist between the debaters. What they're talking about are the issues that are contested. And what we're looking for is the effort on each side to push their argument one way or the other to capture the most territory in the mind of the audience as the audience is evaluating their arguments. So if we're doing our debate about smoking should be banned, we might have a series of issues about which we disagree with the proposition or the opposition. There might be contest over the question of is smoking detrimental to public health? The pro side is going to say it is, the con side is going to say it's not. There might be disagreement about whether the ban will have significant economic consequences. The pro side will say it probably doesn't have significant economic consequences. The con side likely would say it will have dramatic economic consequences. And there might be a question about whether or not smokers have a right to smoke. The pro side saying that they don't have a right to smoke, and the con side saying they do have a right to smoke. Now this in and of itself doesn't tell you much about refutation. But if you understand how these issues work, and you understand what your responsibilities are when dealing with issues, you get a whole wealth of opportunity open to you about how you might engage in the debate. There are two ways that issues interact. First, we interact with the other team. We debate with the other team to achieve what we call distribution. And distribution is the allocation of space within a particular issue. Again, if we imagine that space to be the attention that the audience might give to your arguments, the more attention that they give your argument, the more likely they are to accept that argument, then we can imagine that the contest that happens in the debate and the contest that happens within each issue is to capture the attention of the audience. So when the opposition and the proposition are exchanging arguments, they're really trying to contest ground within each of those issues. For example, during the debate, the issues might get distributed like this. The pro side has very little space in this first issue, and the con side has a great deal of space. Probably means that the audience was more convinced by the con side's arguments within that issue than they were by the pro side's arguments. Similarly, issue number 2, the pro side has a great deal of space occupied, the con side has a little space occupied. That means that in that issue, the pro side captured more attention from the audience than the con side did. But it's always this contest of push back and forth within these issues that demonstrates whether or not the arguments are being accepted by the audience. This, by the way, is what we mean when we talk about direct refutation. One side says smoking has significant public health consequences, the other side says it does not have significant public health consequences, and there's distribution within that issue about whether or not that's true or false. That's the first kind of movement that happens with regard to issues. Distribution back and forth, distribution of ground within each of the issues. But there's also expansion. Expansion refers to the increase or decrease of the size of the issue relative to other issues. So as one issue increases in importance in the mind of the audience, other issues tend to decrease. We imagine the territory of the debate to be fixed territory, it stays the same size, and the only thing that changes is the allocation of ground within that argument. So it's influenced again by the comparison of contrast of issues by the proposition and opposition. It might look like this. In this case, what's happened is that the teams, or maybe one of the teams, has successfully convinced the judge that one issue is far more important than other issues in the round. In this case, it looks like the second issue has gotten more important, and that necessarily means that these other issues, issue number 1 and issue number 3, have become less important. Remember earlier I said, how could you concede that smoking poses a significant public health risk and still win the debate? And the answer was, you convinced the audience that the right to smoke is more important than public health. You're talking about expansion of issues. In this case, the right to smoke is proved to be more important than the concerns about public health. All of that to say that we are using this as a way to differentiate between direct and indirect refutation. So now, all of that groundwork laid, I want to talk about direct refutation first. So direct refutation, how do you go about demonstrating to an audience that there's a problem with an argument? There are essentially 3 tests of argument quality that are useful for debaters. The first test of argument quality, of saying that there's something wrong with the argument as it's been presented, is acceptability. Remember that an argument works because you present evidence that the audience believes. And from that evidence that they believe, you try and connect it to things that they don't yet believe. So if I say to you that smoking should be banned, I've got to give a reason. I've got to find something that you believe in. So I might say smoking should be banned because it poses a significant public health risk. If you believe that, then I've got an argument that works. And I can use that ground, that basis that you accept, that smoking poses a significant public health risk, to move you to accept the claim that we should ban smoking. But if you don't believe that smoking poses a significant public health risk, what do I have to do as a debater? If you don't yet believe that there's a public health risk posed by smoking, what do I have to do? I have to find something else that you might believe, right? So I offer that 2008 World Health Organization report, that factual piece of information that's gathered from a broad range or broad survey of information compiled in statistical fashion, and presented by a credible organization that has no particular interest in arguing one way or the other. Okay, so now I presented a piece of information that you're going to be more likely to accept as true. I moved it forward to the claim that smoking poses a significant public health risk, which then serves as the foundation for proving that we should ban smoking. The test of acceptability asks simply, is the audience accepting of this, or should the audience accept as credible the evidence offered by your opponent? One of the things that you can do when engaging in direct refutation is to say that the opponent has not offered evidence that is acceptable, and then explain reasons why that evidence isn't acceptable. Either because they aren't an authority and shouldn't be believed, or that there's contrary evidence that looks at the evidence they're offering differently, or any variety of ways to prove that that evidence isn't acceptable and therefore should not serve as a foundation for the claims that they want you to accept. That's the first test. Second test is relevance. The relevance test asks whether or not there is a connection between the evidence offered and the conclusions that are drawn. Right? So say, for example, let's change our evidence very slightly. Instead of saying smoking poses a significant public health risk, let's say the evidence that we offer is smoking poses a significant risk to people who smoke. Therefore, we should ban smoking. Now, the evidence might still be true. Generally, it's accepted that people who smoke take on a certain level of health risk. But you could still make an argument that even though the evidence is acceptable, there's not a good connection between that evidence and the claim that you want the audience to accept. There's something wrong with the relevance of the evidence. It's not relevant to the claim that you want the audience to accept. You might say, for example, just because people choose to do things that might be harmful to them is not a reason that we should create laws preventing them from doing those things. You might offer examples of where we tolerate all sorts of risky behavior that people undertake. And if in those cases we tolerate that risky behavior and don't find reason to ban it, then there's not really a good reason why we should prohibit this particularly risky behavior. You're not saying that the evidence is wrong. You're saying, I grant that people die from smoking, but you're questioning the connection between that evidence and the claim that they're ultimately trying to get you to accept. So the question of relevance is a second test of argument quality, another way for you to say, this is why you shouldn't accept that argument as true. And the third test is sufficiency. The test of sufficiency is a more global test. It doesn't necessarily explain a problem with the argument and how it works. It more accurately questions whether or not there is sufficient evidence offered for the proof. So you might say that yes, it's true, smoking poses a significant public health risk, and that is perhaps reason to consider why we should ban smoking, but that there's not enough evidence or not enough people are affected or the evidence isn't cumulatively compelling to prove that we should ultimately take that on. This is a point of transition between perhaps the direct refutation style and the indirect refutation style. But these three tests of argument quality give you something to say. You can say their evidence is wrong, you can say that their reasoning is incorrect, or you can say that ultimately the amount of evidence, the amount of proof that they offer is not sufficient for us to want to accept the claim. This goes to indirect refutation, or to direct refutation. So the next question is, how do you structure your refutation? And this is really the key, because unless you can communicate your refutation clearly, it becomes difficult for the audience to follow your refutation. And I think a good acronym for remembering how to structure refutation is the ICE, or the ICE structural acronym. It reminds you of the 3 steps that you have to undertake in order to refute an argument effectively. So ICE. The first step is to identify your opponent's arguments, to tell the audience which of your opponent's arguments you're going to refer to. So if I'm going to argue about the public health risk, the very first thing I want to say as a debater is, my opponent has argued that smoking poses a significant public health risk. Now you're orienting your audience toward that argument, you're explaining to them what you're going to refute, and you're making sure that they understand which of the arguments you're dealing with. Step number 2 is C, critique. This is where you offer your explanation of the shortcomings of that argument. What's wrong with the argument that the other side has presented? evidence unacceptable? Is the evidence irrelevant to the claim that's being made? Or does it fail to test its sufficiency because it doesn't provide adequate support for the argument? And the third step, perhaps the most important step, is the E step. Explain the consequences of the argument's failure. So they lose this argument. So what? If they lose the argument, if you prove that there is something that is wrong with the argument, then tell the audience what failing to prove that argument means. So, my opponents have argued that smoking poses a significant public health risk and should be banned. They don't offer good evidence of why smoking poses a significant public health risk. And if they can't prove that it poses a significant public health risk, then there's no reason for the government to form some new policy or to make this thing illegal. That three-step process should be repeated every time you encounter a new argument from the opposition. Every time you're taking apart an additional argument from the opposition, you want to explain to your audience both what you're referring to, what's wrong with the argument, and why failing that argument is important for the opposition strategy. Make sense so far? This is all direct refutation. Remember, this is all explaining to the audience why you win the issue as opposed to the other side winning the issue. It has to do with the distribution of ground within those issues. Let's talk then about indirect refutation. Well, here I can give you an example. So this is an example of the ICC, or the ICE approach in the argument that we might be discussing. Again, like we said earlier, our opponents have argued that smokers have a right to smoke. In fact, because smokers expel dangerous pollutants into the air we all breathe, their smoking affects all who don't smoke and can't therefore be considered an exclusive right. And the third one, E, if there's no right to smoke, then we're entitled to regulate this activity like any other that has impacts beyond the person who engages in that activity. What you're doing there is taking on their specific argument about smokers' rights to smoke and proving that, in fact, smokers don't have a right to smoke, pushing back against that issue and trying to claim that territory that they otherwise might have claimed. So, now we can talk about expansion, which is indirect refutation. Expansion has to do with evaluating the relative merit of each of these issues. Which issues are more important? Which ones are you winning? And why are the issues that you're winning more important than the issues that perhaps the other side is losing? So when we compare the relative importance of those issues, we're looking at comparing those issues back and forth, looking at explaining to the judge why, even though you might be losing on one issue, the issue that you are winning on is more important. And this, interestingly enough, is an important part of conceding arguments. It might be to your advantage to admit that the other side is making true statements. It might be to your advantage to say the other side's argument is a legitimate argument. But, for example, in the previous round, when I was watching the zoos round, about whether or not we should close zoos, proposition side was arguing that it is limiting of animals' freedom to keep them in zoos, and therefore we should close all zoos. And the opposition side stood up and said, you know what? They're right. It does limit animals' freedom. But it's far more important that we learn from those animals so we can devise ways to protect them, to protect their environment, and create an appreciation for those animals than it is to give these very few animals their freedom. And so they essentially conceded the argument. They said, you're right, you are limiting animals' freedom. But there's something more important that we get out of that limited freedom that advantages the animals and all animals in general. So it assumes the truth of the other side's arguments, or concedes the truth of the other side's arguments, and still gives a reason not to support the motion. Consider, for example, a motion like this. This House would force private schools to mirror the socioeconomic demographics of the state in which their student body, of their state in their student body, providing financial assistance when necessary. In other words, all private schools would be required by law to accept not just rich kids who could pay for their education, but a demographic of students that looks like the communities in which they exist. So if there are 10% poor students, they have to take 10% poor students. If there are 50% poor students in their community, they have to have a student body made up of 50% of poor students. When you're thinking about these arguments, there are two true statements that each side might make. The proposition might say, look, integration of socioeconomically diverse students provides poor students with tools that can close the gap between rich and poor. And that's true. Poor students get better education, they engage in networking and get to know people and form relationships with people who might help them later in life. They get opportunities and advantages that they might not if they go to worse schools. That's just true. Putting poor students in good schools is good for those students. But the opposition is likely to argue that private schools, as non-public organizations, have the right to limit their student body in a way that they see fit in order to accomplish the goals that they have a right to set. That's also true. It's a private organization. They can identify a particular goal that they want to accomplish, and they can create a student body that helps them accomplish that goal. If that private school wants to be the most elite, best school that is available to students, then that's their right to do so. Both of these statements are true, and it's not likely that the opposition is going to convince a judge that students won't benefit from going to good schools. And it's also not likely that the proposition is going to convince the judge that private schools don't have a right to limit their student body. So that direct refutation probably isn't going to get them very far. These are two true positions. The debate is not about, is that position true or false? The debate is about, which do we care more? Do we care more about private students, or do we care more about the rights of individual institutions? This is where the debate lies in many cases. This is that indirect refutation. When you don't have the ability, or you can't think of good ideas why the arguments they're making are flawed, then your better strategy is to say, that might be true, but something else is more important. But something else should be the primary concern. So how do you go about comparing and contrasting? What are the tools that you have for indirect refutation? I think there are 4 tools that you can use to compare positions that either side takes. 4 ways that you can say, our issue is more important than their issue. Those tools are significance, probability, time frame, and reversibility. And these are names that we give to strategies that most of you have already employed. But understanding how they work and what options exist for you can be very useful if you're trying to think of different ways to oppose cases or to refute cases indirectly that you might otherwise not have a chance to refute. Let's talk about each. Significance asks about the extent of the impact. How big is the impact? How significant is the impact? And the impact, of course, refers to the consequences, right? So what are the consequences of letting poor students get better education? And what are the consequences of letting or making a private institution do something it doesn't want to do? So qualitative and quantitative significance are both options that you have for arguing that the other side is not, does not have the most significant issue. Quantitative significance simply refers to the number of people affected. If you look simply at the number of poor students that might benefit and the number of rich institutions that might be harmed by diminishing their rights, then you might be able to say simply at a quantitative level, we benefit more people and therefore this is the right policy. Words like scope, breadth, dimension, extent, reach, sweep, all of these are words that speak to the number of people affected. That's quantitative significance. But there's also qualitative significance. How big is the impact? Right? How meaningful is the impact? Beyond just the number of people affected, how bad or how good is what happens to them? You might say, for example, that it's far more important to give a poor person opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have than to deny a rich entity a small part of what they want to accomplish. And so you'd be able to say, in terms of the qualitative significance, it's better to give poor people a good chance and doesn't affect rich people a whole lot to take away a small part of their rights. That can be used as a way to compare the two impacts, the qualitative significance of each of those impacts. Words like gravity, seriousness, importance, value, worth, all of those are comparative words that you can use to make the differentiation between the impacts of either scenario. The second test, or the second way to engage in indirect refutation, is to look at the probability of impacts. What is the likelihood of the impact occurring, and which one is more liable? Right? Okay, back to our example about forcing private schools to accept poor students. You might say that it is not at all certain that if you give a poor student a good education, that they are going to eventually be successful. We're not certain about that. It may occur, it may not occur, there's no guarantee. However, if you create a policy that says wealthy schools must admit students who are of lower socioeconomic status, then that is a certain deprivation of that school's rights. That's a certain impact on that school's rights. The policy itself necessarily compromises that school's rights. So in terms of probability, you've got a certain rights deprivation if you force them to take these students, compared with a possible benefit to those students that is in no way guaranteed. Probability is another way to say to your audience, choose the thing that you're most certain in, or in this case, avoid doing the thing that causes the most certain impact. Don't create this deprivation for schools because there's no guarantee that these students are going to succeed. Two different ways you can compare probability. Feasibility asks, can this impact happen? Will it even occur? Is it even possible that this impact occurs? Right? This probably isn't a very good one for our purposes, talking about the school, because it's not necessarily, or there's not necessarily a feasibility problem with either scenario. Can students improve with given good tools? Certainly. Will schools be deprived of right if you make a policy that forces them to accept students they don't want to? Also true. So feasibility probably doesn't work best here. But certainty is a very good one. Will it happen? What is the chance? What is the likelihood? What is the prospect, the risk, or the hazard? This is the example that I was using before to say you can't guarantee that a poor student will capitalize on opportunities given to them, but you can guarantee that if you create this policy, you will deprive the right of schools to choose their own student body. So in that case, you can use probability to compare the two scenarios by simply looking at the likelihood or the certainty with which it takes place. Third way to compare impacts, time frame. Time frame asks about the temporal considerations of the impacts. When will they occur? And sometimes when impacts occur is useful for us making decisions about which impacts are worse or which impacts are better. So you might, for example, argue that we won't know for a long time, or that students wouldn't benefit for a long time from the tools that we give them by admitting them to schools. It takes a long time for them to learn these skills. It takes a longer time for them to capitalize on those skills. And so the outcome is a long ways down the road. But on the other hand, the impacts to the schools for imposing this policy are immediate. Right? They have to let in students they don't otherwise want to let in, and they have to provide them with financial aid that they might not otherwise have. So just in terms of when these impacts occur, you might be able to convince the judge or the audience through indirect refutation by saying, choose the impact scenario that happens most quickly. Choose not to influence these schools because there's lots of time for students to acquire these skills down the road. It takes a long time for them to do so anyway. A couple of different ways you can look at time frame. Immediacy, which impact occurs first. And we use words like priority, delay, precedence, primacy, lag, and horizon to explain which of these impact scenarios is going to occur before the other. But there's also duration, which impact lasts longer. This might be a good way, for example, for the proposition side to answer the indirect refutation from the opposition. If the opposition says, don't make schools admit these students because it's an immediate deprivation of their rights, you might be able to say it might be an immediate deprivation of their rights, but they'll adjust quickly. They'll find new donors, they'll expand their resources, they'll be able to admit more students, and therefore it's a very short-term impact. On the other hand, if you deny a student the ability to learn or the tools that they might otherwise get from this education, that's something that's going to affect them for the rest of their lives. So a school, an institution, can overcome these impacts quickly, but a student, when denied education, might suffer the consequences for the rest of his or her life. So you use duration as a way to answer the immediacy comparison that was made by the other side. And finally, there's reversibility as a test of comparing the two impact scenarios from proposition and opposition. Reversibility asks which impact can be diminished or corrected. If we assume that both impacts could occur, which one is less likely to be bad because it ultimately can be reversed? So there are two ways to look at this. Mitigation is the first. Are there considerations or agencies or policies that correct for one of these impacts? You might say in our debate about forcing schools to admit poor students, you might say, look, if you're on the opposition, you might say, look, if a rich school doesn't admit these students, there are other ways that we can do this. We can improve our public schools. We can give more direct tutoring to these students. We can let them apply for financial aid through the government, and that will make them more competitive. There is a reversible problem that is created by not passing this policy. On the other hand, the opposition might say, if you deny these institutions their right to choose their student body, it will forever change the makeup of those schools, admitting students that otherwise wouldn't be there, that aren't necessarily wanted by the institution, and might struggle with their placement in those. So that's a problem that is never going to change. So if there are other ways to do it that are reversible, other ways to address the problem, and the consequences of not doing it are irreversible, then you should always prefer the reversible to the irreversible. Same goes with remediability. Can the harms of the impact be fixed? Are they correctable or curable? Not really a good example from our schools debate, but there's a good example of debates that have to do with environment, right? Often we have debates about, should we undertake this policy to promote growth and development at the cost of the environment? And often remediability is an important part of that debate, because people will say, if we don't do this type of development here, then we can always do it somewhere else. If we don't have this economic opportunity here, we can always find some other economic opportunity. But on the other hand, if we destroy the environment, then we're never going to have a chance to get that back. Once it's gone, and it doesn't ever return. So remediability in this case says, can the harms of this impact ever be reversed? And this is a way that you can say, our impacts are worse because they can't be reversed. Their impacts aren't so bad because they can be reversed. Ultimately, what you're doing, though, is comparing the influence or the significance of each of these different issues relative to other issues. And in so doing, you're creating an opportunity for you to respond to the arguments made by the other side and ideally capture as much attention of the audience as you possibly can when debating pro and con. Questions? What questions do you have?
How do you decide about as a judge, how do you decide about your certain arguments that the existing one is
I'm sorry.
it's concerning about the duration of the arguments. If it was being trial, once we bring that past that. After that, it's not strictly standardized everything, but was clear brought out by the lower house. And you consider that will be arguing that was discussed across the board.
I'm still not sure I understand your question, so I'm going to make sure I get it before I try and answer it, okay? Are you asking about consistency of arguments between the first half and the second half?
No.
Okay.
I was asking if one argument was brought up in the first, in the upper thing, and was the not responded like then it was brought up.
Okay. So you're asking, can you refute an argument that maybe happened in the first? If you're in the second half of the debate, can you refute an argument that happened in the first half of the debate? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That means anything that is on the other side is fair game for you to refute.
And then if it was refuted, do you say that this argument is expanded, its range?
Well, that's a much trickier question to answer. That depends upon your certainty that you successfully refuted that argument. Right? Depends on whether or not you believe you convinced the judge or that the refutation that happened earlier convinced the judge. I guess I would say this. Since you never get to ask a judge in the middle of a debate, do you believe this, right? There's no red light or green light, right? You're making an argument, the light is red, I haven't convinced, suddenly it's green, right? I must have convinced them. You don't have that option, right? That'd be great, but that doesn't happen. So I always say, do your best best to cover as much ground as you possibly can. And if it means you're adding another level of refutation to something that's already been refuted, excellent. Because then you're adding additional material that might count in your favor and adding additional reason to reject the other argument from the other side. Did that answer your question? It's a good question. Good question. Other questions about refutation? How about this? When do you refute? In your speech. You've got 7 minutes. When do you engage in refutation? Generally, you want to do it at the first opportunity, although there are some Canadians out there who believe the refutation comes best at the end of your speech. I think it makes more sense to engage in refutation first, and then end your speech with your constructive material. Generally, I think it's better to leave the judge thinking about your territory than to leave the judge thinking about the other side's territory. And invariably, even when you're refuting material from the other side, you're drawing attention to those arguments. You're making the judge pay attention to those arguments. And when you're doing that, it means that you're perhaps giving those arguments more credence than they otherwise would have. So I think it's always best to refute first, and then to present your constructive material. How about this? If the proposition side makes 4 arguments, and you're the first opposition speaker, how many do you have to refute? 4.
Not necessarily.
It depends on,
It depends.
If their arguments are all very strong, then I think it's better for you to back them up. But if some of them are weak or some of them may be weak, and the judge can, the judge may not convinced by them, and also you need to just point out one word or one sentence can their arguments seem ridiculous. I think you should focus on more on the strong arguments.
It's an excellent answer. I thought I was going to trick you, but you found my trick question very easy to answer. Yeah, it depends. They make 4 arguments. Does not mean you have to refute all 4. It means you have to think about the ones that you're refuting. Pick them carefully. Sometimes there are 4 strong arguments, and each one should be refuted. Sometimes there are 3 terrible arguments and 1 good argument, and that's the one you should focus on. But always remember that in addition to making that decision, which do I refute, you need to explain that decision to the judge. You need to say, proposition has 4 arguments. 3 of them are terrible. Or 2 of them are terrible, 1 of them is irrelevant, but 1 is really important. You need to explain to the judge why you're choosing the arguments you're choosing. And I think this is the most difficult thing for new debaters, is to understand why they're engaging in the material from the other side. Often they will, I watched so many debate rounds where one side will refute the previous speaker's arguments, but they'll pick and choose things that they maybe heard or things that they have something to say about, but they don't really have a good reason for refuting the arguments that they're refuting. I want to understand, as a judge, I want to understand why you've chosen to refute that argument and not this other one over here. I want to understand why you choose to ignore this whole argument, but focus on that. You need to remember that you're not only refuting the arguments, you're explaining your strategy at the same time. I'm going to focus on this issue because we concede the rest of those arguments. I'm going to focus on this issue because there was no explanation. I'm going to focus on this issue because all the rest of them have no relevance. Tell me why you're choosing the ones you're choosing, and you'll be much better at convincing me that your position is the right position. Other questions?
If a refutation has to be as complicated as this, why don't you simply make it into an argument? Make it your own material.
You certainly can, right? And in a lot of ways, the question is a really good one. You said, look, if refutation is this complex, why not just make it into a constructive argument and make it your own argument? Terrific question. And the first answer that I would have for you is the distinction between deconstructive and constructive argumentation, the distinction between refutation and building arguments is an artificial distinction. In real life, when we're talking to people, we work them together all the time, right? We smush them. Sometimes we're engaging in critique of other arguments, and sometimes we're building our own arguments, and sometimes, in order to critique a different argument, we have to build our own argument first, right? So these things, the distinction between them is an artificial distinction at best. So you're absolutely right. Sometimes your best way to go about approaching the argument is to both engage in deconstructive and constructive at the same time. Matter of fact, I far prefer, and I think better debaters recognize, that you should never separate your speech into deconstruction first and then construction second, but you should organize your speech around the points of clash that are being contested by the proposition and the opposition side. That way you say, look, the first point of clash is cigarette smoking a public health hazard? You can present your constructive position and at the same time critique their constructive position. And then once you're done with that substantive topical area, you move on to the next question, which is, do smokers have a right to smoke? It makes a lot more sense to do it that way than to try and separate your speech into deconstructive first and talk about why they failed to prove that smoking is a public health problem. And then 2 minutes later, do your constructive argument where you offer evidence that smoking is not a public health hazard. Right? Makes more sense to combine those efforts, what we would call topical organization, rather than duty-based or role-based organization. Other questions? All right, we only have about 5 minutes until the exercises are supposed to begin, so I think at this point you are to make your way to your exercise room. It's too hot to exercise.